Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study entitled Recommended Reading. And I would like to recommend that you read 1st and 2nd Peter. We're going to be talking about 1st Peter today. Both 1st and 2nd Peter are written as survival manuals, and they're written towards the end of Peter's life, and they're written from Rome. We talked over these last 5 years multiple times about the burning of Rome in AD 64, the persecution of Christians that followed as they were blamed by Nero for the burning of Rome, the death of Paul in the aftermath, and then a little later the death of Peter in the aftermath, and then waves of persecution. Some really strong persecution between AD 64 and AD 149 when Hadrian issued his rescript, which was enforced until about 280 AD, which gave Christians a bit of a reprieve from the worst part of the physical persecution that they were experiencing. So First Peter and Second Peter are written near the end of Peter's life when he's in Rome, not long before he passes. He tells us that he knows his death is imminent in Second Peter, the same way Paul does in Second Timothy. And he has things he needs to say to the church before he goes. And both books are written in exactly that way. In fact, in Second Timothy, he says, or Second Peter, he says, "I'm writing this as a reminder, so that when I'm gone, you'll remember these things." First Peter is written to address the first problem that the church is really going to, existential crisis of the church, and Second Peter is addressing the second. And of course, the church is going to survive, large or small. The church will survive, but persecution was the first topic that Peter dealt with, and then false teaching was the second. And First Peter is written as a survival manual for persecution. And in First Peter, he says in the very first chapter, in the very first section of the first chapter, he says um, he talks about them being distressed for a while by various trials. He talks about the fiery ordeal that they are experiencing in chapter 4. He talks about the day of visitation when evildoers are going to come your way in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And he talks about suffering for doing good and being interrogated while you're suffering for doing good in chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. He's not talking about something theoretical that might happen to them. He's talking to them about something that was already happening to them and that they were going to experience in even greater intensity. And so First Peter is written as a survival manual for the church, how to survive persecution. It's interesting that the three themes, confidence and preparedness and action, all three of which are communicated in the first chapter and are persistent throughout, is what he tells the church to do. And of course, he's already experienced periods of persecution in the aftermath of the stoning of Stephen, when everybody was scattered except the apostles, and they stayed there in Jerusalem during that intense persecution. And he knows the last thing Christians can do is go underground and hide. And so he begins in chapter 1, verses 3 through 12, saying, listen, you need to be confident in the living hope that you have, because what we have cannot be taken away from us. It's kept by God in heaven. And he continues to tell us that if God is our Father, we need to live righteous lives, visibly righteous lives in the face of all this persecution. A theme he's going to pick up on in chapter 2 when he says, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, people of God's own possession. Therefore, you need to keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that when the evildoers come on the day of visitation, they will see your good deeds and glorify God. And so we have to have that sort of confidence, that faith, that things are going to turn out the way things are supposed to turn out. And then we have to live our lives. We have to gird our minds for action, as he says in chapter 1, verse 13. Be prepared to act, not to go underground and hide, but to act. And we prepare ourselves by having this faith that he mentions over and over again in chapter 1, a faith that protects us, a faith that focuses us, a faith that keeps us on track. And we have to get our relationships right, not just with each other in the church, but in our homes, and also with the people around us and with the state. It's interesting that he says, honor the king, but fear God. Submit to every human institution, be law-abiding citizens, but don't disobey God to do that. It's such an important lesson that he teaches us to be respectful of everybody, but always be faithful to God, and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He keeps reminding them of Jesus' own sufferings, and especially at the end of chapter 2, but also in chapter 3, beginning of chapter 4, he's saying the same thing that Paul says in Philippians 3, that when you suffer for righteousness, you are elevated. This is going to purify your faith, chapter 1, and it's going to give you fellowship with Jesus Christ. Anyway, he talks about the elders providing proper leadership during this difficult time in chapter 5, verse 1, and then talks about the way we're all going to face the devil, that we're all of us in a war zone, we're all of us at risk. We have to be alert and resist him, firm in our faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. So this is the survival manual for living in a hostile world, in a hostile environment. And it was used that way in the first 200 years of church history. The way we have newcomers classes, we have evidence that in many congregations, their newcomers class, their new Christians class, was to study 1 Peter as a survival manual for living a faithful Christian life in a hostile world. And don't we still need that same education, that same direction? So I'd like to recommend that you read 1 Peter, but read it as a survival manual because that's what it is. Well, we're going to talk about 2 Peter and the survival manual that it is as well next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.